astrology as if they were self-contained.
They are
But if there's one thing we know.
Okay, and then the share, the play. All right. So, and that's what we did. I like the concept. Now, one of the things too that's very, very important is this concept of terminological clarification. This is a point that Vygotsky makes throughout his work, and it's one of the big problems in interpreting his work is that terms are used and people take the meaning that they have in their conceptual neuronal network and then impose that on Vygotsky's meaning. So here was a sentence from Novak: helped civilize the barbarians. And I pretty much can guarantee that every single one of you had a negative reaction to this. No? Some did, some didn't. So the key terms here, what do we mean by civilize? Or what does Novak, who wrote this, mean by civilize? And what does Novak mean by barbarian? And so Novak is basing his work on the work of Lewis Morgan that I mentioned last time, who looked at the matrilineal. He uses the word savagery, and again, that can have a negative connotation. Savagery for Morgan and for Novak was very specific. It marked a time in human development, and that time had characteristics: control of fire, development of the bow and arrow, and that's a piece of pottery that one of the most ancient found in a fragment found in a cave in China. The word savage means from the trees. It means that the people are very much still connected with nature. And in that sense, there's no real negative connotation. The negative connotation was introduced by the Catholic Church mostly when they then started their exploitation of the world, particularly in the Americas, and justified killing, wiping out the knowledge, wiping out the understanding of the indigenous populations because they were savages. It was okay to kill them. In what's now the area around Mexico, there were 16 million people at the beginning of the 1500s before the Spaniards and the Portuguese arrived, well, the Spaniards arrived there. 100 years later, there was 1.5 million people because they had been slaughtered or killed through disease. And so the justification was these people are subhuman. They're savages. And therefore it was okay to exploit them and steal their resources. And so Morgan wasn't using it in that sense. He was using it to mark an age, a period, a stage, sort of like we do with Bronze Age or the Stone Age, and then the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age. Very specific criteria. So he was talking about this as a stage of human development. Morgan writes, American Indian tribes' institutions, arts, inventions, and practical experience possesses a high and special value reaching far beyond the Indian people themselves. His concept wasn't these were savages. His concept was we can learn a lot from indigenous people. Barbarism, and that comes from PIE is a Proto-Indo-European language, which we'll look at. Barbar means it's unintelligible speech, or the Greek foreign speech. So anybody that spoke a different language was considered a barbarian. Because they spoke a different language was not a comment on their character, nature, their civilization, which came later. And barbarism was based on domestication of crops and of animals. And this gives you a little bit of a feel for the different areas and which crops and when they came in. And so this is a very, it's a scientific way of looking at human development based on the artifacts, etc. And barbarism was also noted for the use of metals, so bronze in particular. And these are some bronze items that were found in a cave in what is now Germany. And then the word civilization comes from society, public life, civic order, citizen, from a townsperson. And there's a distinction with civilization. One is looking at what's called the genteel society, or that which is based on genus, the family, the clan, and how that is organized. And there is a word that Greeks had, societas, for that particular kind of civilization. And a different one with when you came into the cities. Civis is also that's the foundation for cities. So civilization is marked by the development of the river civilizations, and we looked at this last week a bit. When you have rivers, they keep bringing in fresh supplies of dirt, and so you can, or soil, so you can have a more stable population, and you can then sustain a larger population. And so it's moving from a tribal structure to a city structure. And that's what he's talking about with civilization. And there's a tendency for us to think civilization, therefore Western civilization, and all the crimes that have been committed by, in particular, the European colonial powers and now the United States imperialist powers, wiping out populations, going and dropping as much armament on the Middle East, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers come together, and was dropped in all of Vietnam. And so this is to take what is being done today by Western civilization and think that that's what Novak is talking about, is faulty logic, but it's easy to do. Another piece of the civilization was marked by the development of written language and numbers. And this comes about through the trade. When you're trading, you've got to know how many bushels of something you put into a container, so that on the other end, the person knows how many are there and how much they're supposed to pay for, and that then comes back to the owner. So the trade, it was a way to do accounting, and that accounting and those numbers then help set the foundation for written alphabets, and there's different cuneiform forms there. The other piece of it is the moving to iron, and Novak writes a lot about that, how iron qualitatively transformed. So that's what he's talking about with civilization. And the problem is that what we tend to do is to use the language and the concepts that were shaped by Christianity and the Catholic Church, especially those of us that grew up in English-speaking countries. That's part of our conceptual network. And if we don't question that, then we run into big problems when we're really trying to understand what's going on in the world and how people are writing about it. So it's really important when you're reading and you come across a word that you think is a key word, like the ones I've put up, to go to the etymological dictionary. Then you can see how that concept evolved from the Proto-Indo-European through the Greek and the Latin for the most part. But that Proto-Indo-European also extended down into the Mideast and into India and Bangladesh. And so, and it's also important to look up a concept like barbarism in Wikipedia. How many of you did that? You looked up barbarism. Yeah, it was helpful, wasn't it?
Yeah. And by the way, barbarian or barbary, which is the Arabian equivalent, refers to the group of tribes that lived in North Africa. We call them barbarian or barbary. We don't mean insult, that's just a description for them. And we call ourselves Badu, which is the equivalent of barbarian. And we have a law during the unification of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, actually called the civilization of the Bedouin, hence the civilization of the Barbarian. That's why I didn't fit it, because the aim was to group us into a cities instead of being roaming around deserts and rivers and mountains.
Yeah, and it's this transition from tribal to more larger urban areas, yes. And trade is key for that. But you spend most everything that I talk about, I learned this week because I looked at Wikipedia or at other sources. Yes.
So why do you think that language and concepts are shaped by Christianity and Catholic Church? Is it because that they were the ones that were aggressively going out, yes, and recruiting people in their cult?
Well, no, it's not. Yeah,
I mean,
yes, it was.
Just, you know,
that's a very good question. And initially, when the Europeans, and we're talking Christopher Columbus, who was supported by Queen Isabella, and the church went and discovered new people. He actually used the word race, but he used race to mean they spoke a different language. It didn't have anything to do with their pigmentation or the concept of race we have now. It just was, they were different because they spoke a different language. That then got turned around, and when the Europeans discovered all of this gold and silver, other resources in the New World, they stole it. And in order to do that, they put down the native population there. And the reason that they used it was they were subhuman. They were human, but they were on a lower level. They were savages, and they were pagans. They did not believe in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. They would go into a village, have somebody in Spanish read out and say, if you do not take Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior, we will execute you. They didn't understand Spanish. They didn't get saved, and so they got wiped out. Then the purpose, when it says, when Aleli says, they recruited, what they did was to try to convert them. So you had these missionaries coming behind the conquistadors, converting, and then once they become Christians, then how do you justify continuing to massacre them? Because they were a different race. They were a lower race. And so that's when we say this, and when you look at in the etymology, you look at how these words evolve, and you can trace exactly how the Catholic Church in particular changed the language, the meaning of these words.
Could it be also that because the Catholic Church, I'm not defending it or anything at all, just a thought, like they're the only ones that have notes of it because the other side did not have any. What was the other side thinking? On the other hand, like let's say, for example, as you made an example that Christopher Columbus went and converted these other people, and then if they didn't convert, they were massacred and stuff like that. But on the other hand, how did they look at them? That's not
When you say, when you use
the indigenous people, how did they look at Columbus in a way? But it's not written, and so we don't know, right?
Well, we can tell in part by some of them actually welcomed, looked at them as sort of these were coming of the gods, a certain god. And we don't know how, and this is the real crime of it, is that their language, their scientific achievements were wiped out. It's unbelievable when you look at the civilizations that existed in these indigenous populations in Mexico with the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire and the Mayans. The Mayans had a calendar that was accurate for hundreds of thousands of years in the future. Think of the science needed to build the pyramids. The science needed to build the architecture, the cities. It was unbelievable, and that's been wiped out. Leroy asked a question about the science of the indigenous people, and that's something that is now being sort of reclaimed, but it was wiped out. And so that's why it's important for us to really think about our own conceptual neuronal network. What were the forces what were the main influences that brought about the way that you were thinking and the way that you're looking at the world. And that's often unexamined. We spend hours and hours and hours in schools, and you're getting one perspective. And that perspective is the perspective of the ruling class. They control education, they control the media. I'm sorry?
The law.
They have power, right? And so all of us have been influenced by that. And it's important that we rethink, we look, we critically examine our own conceptual networks. So to further on the terminological clarification, there's a concept like slavery. And what's the etymology of slavery? It's quite interesting. It comes from the Proto-Indo-European, changing allegiance from individual to master. And the word famulus means servant, a slave. For the Greeks, the slaves were part of the household. They were considered part of the family. And then it's another interesting piece that Natalia will be interested in, and other Russian speaking. The Slavs were tribes that the Greeks used as slaves to bring back to their communities, take care of the livestock, take care of the crops. And so Slav then they were looked at as slaves. And the word in Russian that Vygotsky uses, slovo, is a key piece of it, because, and it's, you'll see, the misinterpretation of the central theme, the essence of his work revolves around this concept of znaczenie slovo, which means znaczenie is meaning, slovo is word, but it's not the meaning of particular words. He's using word to mean all languaging. And yet all the interpretations talk about word meaning. He's talking about the internal system. He's talking about the internal conceptual neuronal network. He's not talking about the external meaning of words. And those two things, they're related, but they're different. And again, this way of thinking. So when anybody asks you, what do you mean by meaning, which is a really important question, we throw that all around time. You'll hear it in educational, making meaning, meaning making. What do they mean by meaning? If anybody asks you what you mean by meaning, you can say, well, to me, it has two distinct but related meanings. One is an internal, the internal system of meaning that I have developed through my life. And the other is the external meaning that my society, social group, that which is captured in the dictionaries.
Coming inward or going outward?
But you see, one of the big things that we might want to think about in this seminar is not using the word or.
Both. Both. So the social is, because I can't see it, the social influence going other than.
Because we're influencing the social with our externalization. So whenever you use the word or, stop, think, because there's a very good chance instead of or, it's both and. I met a colleague and we were out walking and she said, well, I'm sort of black or white, you know, in my thinking. And I said, I am black and white, because black and white incorporates the whole color spectrum that exists between black and white.
Both the internal and the external affects the perception.
Yes, yes, yeah. Then there was a term, a new or a different kind of slavery. What does that mean? And Novak points out that what he's really talking about is a bondsman. And that's like an indentured servant. And I went and looked up the etymology of indentured, which was very, very interesting, because indenture means that you have a contract with somebody that you're going to work until you fulfill the terms of the contract, and then you're free. If you are not free until that contract, they own you, they control you, you are their slave. That's what he's talking about with this different kind of slavery. But what happened was that they wrote the contract on two sides of a piece of paper and then tore that piece of paper in a jagged pattern. And when you think of indent, you think of dentures, and it looks like tooth marks on this piece of paper. Then those two pieces of paper go back together again and can't be forged. And so that's, this is the thing that I love, is just exploring and learning things like that. So, what was that?
I feel like I'm a commercial slave.
Yes. Yes, yeah, yes. Then there's a word, and this is one that Vygotsky people have criticized, because Vygotsky uses the word primitive. And we tend to think of that as a derogative term. A primitive people, they're lesser than we are. And primitive just means first. Primary numbers, you know about them, don't you, Mr. Math? And so he's always, when you see primitive in Vygotsky, don't think that he is making a value judgment about these people. He's talking and saying these are the first peoples. These are ancient people. And they can be studied by looking at those populations that haven't been completely destroyed by civilization and seeing how they interact. And there's the artifacts, all of the archaeology, the tools, and all of that shows the nature of their existence. And so just keep that in mind. Then people tend, when they think of the word colonization, to think of European colonization. But the Greek colonization was very, very different. And so you can't just take a concept of colonization and apply it to the Greeks, taking all of the negative sides of it. Look where the word comes from. It's a tenant farmer, a settler in a new land. And it comes from to cultivate. And it's interesting. The word cultivate also is the origin of culture. And so culture very much was tied to the way that early humans cultivated the land. And that then determined a lot of their culture and their language. And then it's also that piece of respect that's in there, which we don't think about. To get an idea of what the Greek colonization looked like, This is an area up in the steppes. I think I misspelled that. The steppes, I always have a problem whether it's steeps, and that's because I misspell it. The steppes hypothesis. Around 4000 BCE, there's a group of nomadic tribes that lived up in this area between and this is what the steppes look like in that vast plains. And this is the modern map, just so you can, it was coming up, the influence was coming up from the Sumerians, from Africans, the agriculture in Africa, their knowledge of agriculture based on their civilization being in these different river communities. That then went up through between the seas, up into these vast plains. And these nomadic tribes had two big advantages. They were the first ones to domesticate horses. And horses can be used in agriculture and war. And so they were also the first ones to develop the wheel, which also gave them a huge advantage. And so one particular group that existed, and it was a dominant group up in that area, was Yamnaya. And you can see how that influence has spread throughout Europe, even up to England. This is the DNA, that little blue. So even in England, it's half of the DNA from these nomadic tribes. And what happened in these plains was that they would develop the agriculture, they would have a population, and then the population got too big, and so they had to expand. The way that they expanded was to go to a neighboring tribe, and they had horses, and so it was easy for them to sort of impose their will, but they were also bringing tremendous knowledge and supplies to these people. And I talked about how with different tribes of matrilineal, you needed females and males from other tribes to intermarry, to marry. And so they would then go to a new population. They would become integrated in. It wasn't destroying, it was building those communities, taking the agricultural expertise and teaching these other peoples about how to produce and how to use horses. The language that came with them then became a combination of this language that had come up from the Sumerians and the Egyptians. And that technical language was transferred to all of these new colonies that they set up. And that's how they spread. And it's very interesting, the influence that they had in the areas that they colonized. The Proto-Indo-European language was the language that developed there. And you can see the Proto-Indo-European, the word for father, the E is in red because in transcription, the E is reversed. And I couldn't figure that out. And so you can see all of the different words. They're not very clear, but padre, pater, and then it became father. And then in the Indo-Iranian, Pipter is, and so this language then spread along with this, and this just gives a breakdown. This is of Indo-European language. The Proto-Indo-European language is the basis, the foundation for 400 different languages. And the ones in green are ones that still exist. So like the Greek still exists, but Latin in the red does not. But you can see how, and then English is down here at the bottom. The way that they reconstructed it is really fascinating because there is no written record. So what linguists have done is to go and look at all of the existing languages in the world today, and then take a particular word and trace it back. So it's back building to then reconstruct this whole language, which existed, 2, 3, 4,000 years BCE, but now has been reconstructed. And that, so that whenever you're looking in there's an online etymological dictionary that I think is one of the best ones. And when you look in there, you can trace it from the Proto-European, Proto-Indo-European to see how that has then evolved. So last time we ended up with the Aegean civilizations and trade. And the orange is the Phoenicians and the blue is the Greeks. And so you can see the tremendous expanse of their influence. And one of the things that happened, one of the ways that they colonized was the Greeks would go and set up an emporium, a trading center, a market. And then other peoples would come and they would then trade. But pretty soon, those emporiums became cities because some of the Greeks were there, some of the local population was there. And so you had, like in Alexandria, Egypt, you had big populations of Jews, big populations of Greece. Alexandria, that one of the kings of Alexandria, built one of the most impressive libraries in the history of humanity and got information from all over. And when we think about the influence of the Greeks were influenced by other peoples, the Sumerians, Hittites, the Africans. And so it's not, that Greek is not a stable language and influence. It's an accumulation. And that's the big point that Novak was saying, that you're getting all of these different cultures, all of these different ways of looking at and understanding the world. And they're concentrated in these trading cities like Miletus. And so this is Raphael's School of Athens. And he painted, this is in the Vatican. And I saw it, 10, 12 years ago. But unfortunately, at that time, my conceptual neuronal network was deficient. And so I didn't have I didn't have the same perspective on it that I would now. Now, Vince, are you going to the Vatican when you go to Italy? No, okay. But you can see the two main figures in the center, the blue robe and the red robe, are Aristotle on the right, and then Plato. And then to the left of Plato, there's a figure in the robe, and that was Socrates, and he was always engaged in dialogue. And then down to the far left side in blue is Epicurus, we'll talk about in a minute. And then Pythagorean is there doing his numbers. And there in the middle is Heraclitus. And it's said that Raphael painted Heraclitus sort of resembling himself, and Aristotle resembling Leonardo da Vinci. But Heraclitus, as you can see, is by himself, not interacting. And then you go to the far right and you see Euclid there bending over with his compass, and then behind him Ptolemy, and that back to us with a brown cape. He has the world, and his concept was the world was at the center of the universe. And if you question that, the Catholic in the Dark Ages, if you question that, just question that concept, you would be burned at the stake. That's how they shut down any inquiry that all had to do with what was in the best interests of the church. And the guy sort of sprawled out there, Diogenes, the older guy, he influenced Seneca, who founded the school of Stoicism, which was very influential. So Heraclitus, he uses the word logos, and we tend to think of logos just as a word. And it's interesting from the Proto-European that it means to collect. And so you're collecting information. When you're going out and interacting with the world, you're collecting. And so logos also meant collecting. It's interesting too, computation, because everything, if you're going to measure anything, it's measured in relationship to something else. The Latin word for reason is ratio, and ratio is the relationship between two objects. And so logos is also the foundation of math. A term that Novak attributes to, well, not just Novak, everybody, to Heraclitus is the concept of flux. And we tend to think of that as means to flow, but to change. And he says everything is in a state of flux, but that's not what Heraclitus said. Heraclitus said everything is in a state of change, but that there's also stability in that change. And here again, it's a way of thinking that things are in motion, but there's also stability. And those two things are key, those two concepts, but it tends to be just that it's change. And the other one is fire. And he's using it as in two different ways, as that you can see a sort of block was, one is inanimate and the other is animate. So the inanimate is referring to it as a substance, a manifestation. But the animate is a living force. So fire for him was really the equivalent of energy. And that energy exists as a natural force, and that energy is manifest in different objects, in matter. And so for Heraclitus, the big question was, how does nature speak to us? And when we think of nature, nature is the whole thing. How does it speak to us? And that's exactly, remember the quote from last week with that Paul Stamets on the fungi. We need to listen to the world and understand the world. And this is a concept that Heraclitus had. So if we look at his universe, he uses logos to refer to everything there. The entire universe is logos. That's what he means by logos. He's not just talking about a word. He's talking about the entire universe. And he's really looking at discourse with nature, listening to nature. And that's where dialectic comes in. Dialectic is listening, is conversation, and he's talking about conversation with nature. This is how humanity developed all science, was interacting with nature and listening to, observing it, and coming to understand it. And so the fire equals the energy. And one of the key pieces for all of the philosophers was that they looked at process. They didn't just look at manifestation. And so that flux is part of this process, the change, but it's also manifest in more stable forms. And so the fire is both the energy that's for the whole universe and the energy as it appears in nature. And Heraclitus wrote in aphorisms, everything, one, everything. And right there it captures this dialectical thinking, the opposites. One is part of everything, and everything is made up of ones. And so another one of his famous one is that Novak quotes, "You cannot step into the same river twice." And this quotation, a lot of Heraclitus's work was destroyed, not saved. But this statement was one that Plato attributed to Heraclitus based on some of his followers. Heraclitus did not say this. He said you can't even step into the same river once. When you think of the river, what do you think of? Water.
Running water.
Water. But is that a river? So this is a river. Water. So what is a river? A river is made up not only of the water, but of the bed and the banks. That whole thing is the river. And it's this change, but stability in the riverbank. And that's what all of nature is like, is this elements of change and stability. He also said that you can't, well, it depends upon your perspective. So seawater for a fish is good, right? For humans, not good. So it's the same seawater, but it has differences. And there's a story I won't go into now of seawater and the fact that I'm standing here, because that seawater played a huge piece of my existence. So I'll leave it up to Mohammed or Fräulein to say, what about that seawater at some point? So there's this unity of change and stability, and that's a key piece. Democritus came up with an atomic theory, and it comes from the Greek indivisible, to cut. And what he did was he cut a stone. If you cut a stone, you have the two halves, but then you can cut that half again and again and again and again, and until it's indivisible. Do you recognize this picture here? It's in Saudi Arabia. I think is it Taru? Huh?
Oh, that's in Latin area.
Yeah, and it shows everything, that everything can be broken down further. But then he said, you get to one piece that cannot be cut anymore. And that's where Adam comes from. He had the concept of an atom and the preservation of matter back that long ago. His view of it, though, was that these atoms came down from the heavens. And you know what? I think what I'm going to do is stop here and
Stepping up the climax.
just a second.